holding on to. Global's network anchor Donna Friesen sat down with the Prime Minister.
Such a pleasure to meet you in person.
This is not just the story of a new Prime Minister learning the ropes of politics. This is the story of how a trade war with the United States, shifting global alliances, and a breakdown of long-standing economic rules are forcing Canada to redraw its place in the global economy. Less than 1 year ago, Mark Carney was not an elected official. Today, he stands at the center of one of the most consequential trade confrontations North America has seen in decades. A confrontation driven by tariffs, uncertainty, and a rapidly changing relationship with the United States. His first year in office did not unfold quietly. Instead, it opened with escalating trade pressure from Washington, rising tensions over steel and automobiles, and a growing realization in Ottawa that the old assumptions about economic partnership no longer hold. This is happening as the global economy enters a period of fragmentation, supply chains are being reconsidered, alliances are being tested, and middle powers like Canada are being forced to make strategic choices that will shape jobs, prices, and national security for years to come. At stake is more than diplomacy. It is about who absorbs the economic pain of tariffs, how trade wars affect ordinary consumers, and whether the United States gains leverage or loses trust among its closest partners. And as we will reveal later in this analysis, there is a strategic calculation unfolding behind the scenes that could permanently alter how Canada deals with Washington. Stay with us to the end, because the final implications may surprise even seasoned trade analysts. To understand why this trade war matters, it is essential to look beyond political language and focus on the underlying economic mechanics. What began as targeted tariffs has evolved into a broader test of how resilient the North American trade relationship truly is. The United States remains Canada's largest trading partner by a wide margin. Every year, hundreds of billions of dollars in goods cross the border, supporting millions of jobs on both sides. Automobiles, steel, energy, agriculture, and advanced manufacturing form the backbone of this exchange. When tariffs are introduced into the system, the effects ripple far beyond government negotiating rooms. In the past year, tariffs imposed by the United States on key Canadian exports disrupted established supply chains. Steel producers faced higher costs. Automotive manufacturers experienced uncertainty in pricing and sourcing. These pressures did not remain confined to factories. They flowed downstream to consumers through higher prices and to workers through hiring slowdowns and delayed investment. At the same time, the broader global economy has been shifting. Trade wars are no longer isolated disputes. They intersect with national security, industrial policy, and geopolitical competition. Countries are reassessing where they source critical materials, where they manufacture goods, and which partners they can rely on during periods of crisis. For Canada, this moment has forced a recalibration. Officials in Ottawa increasingly acknowledge that dependence on a single dominant partner creates vulnerability. The trade war with the United States has accelerated efforts to diversify export markets, attract foreign investment from Europe and Asia, and build domestic industrial capacity. From Washington's perspective, tariffs are framed as leverage. The stated objective is to protect domestic industries and rebalance trade. However, the data increasingly shows that the economic burden of tariffs is shared, often falling heavily on businesses and consumers within the United States itself. This is where the situation becomes more complex. As tariffs persist, they begin to reshape political incentives, corporate strategies, and voter sentiment. What started as a tactical trade maneuver now risks becoming a structural shift in how North America conducts economic relations. And this leads to a critical question that cannot be ignored. If tariffs continue and the trade war deepens, who ultimately pays the price and who quietly gains strategic advantage? Stay with us, because the next stage is where these economic decisions begin to carry political consequences that neither Washington nor Ottawa can easily reverse. Trade wars rarely remain confined to spreadsheets and customs forms. Over time, economic pressure accumulates, expectations harden, and policy disagreements begin to spill into the political arena. That is precisely what is now unfolding between Canada and the United States. What initially appeared as a series of tariffs tied to specific sectors has gradually evolved into a broader political confrontation. The issue is no longer limited to steel quotas or automobile supply chains. It now touches trust, credibility, and the rules that have governed North American trade for decades. When Mark Carney publicly stated that the United States could no longer be treated as a fully reliable partner, the statement marked a turning point. This was not campaign rhetoric. It was a signal to markets, investors, and allies that Ottawa was preparing for a prolonged period of uncertainty. At the center of the dispute lies the framework governing continental trade. The agreement known in Washington as USMCA was designed to reduce friction and create predictability. Yet repeated tariffs, particularly on steel and automotive components, have raised questions about whether those commitments are being honored in practice. From the perspective of the United States, tariffs are framed as a tool of leverage. They are presented as necessary to protect domestic industry and rebalance trade relationships. But as the trade war persists, the political costs begin to rise. Businesses delay investment, workers face uncertainty, consumers encounter higher prices, even if those increases arrive gradually and unevenly. This is where the trade war enters a new phase. Economic friction turns into political stress. Legislators, governors, and industry leaders begin pressing Washington for clarity. At the same time, Ottawa faces growing domestic pressure to demonstrate that it can protect jobs, stabilize prices, and defend national interests without escalating the conflict further. In this environment, tariffs stop being a technical policy instrument. They become a political signal, one that reverberates through elections, diplomatic meetings, and long-term strategic planning. The escalation is also shaped by political timing. In the United States, trade policy is increasingly intertwined with electoral considerations. Decisions about tariffs are no longer judged solely on economic merit, but on how they resonate with voters in manufacturing regions and strategic industries. For Canada, this creates a difficult calculus. Waiting out political cycles carries risks. Engaging too aggressively risks retaliation, yet doing nothing is not an option. The trade war has already altered expectations within the global economy, and inaction can be interpreted as weakness. Ottawa's response has been to widen the playing field. While negotiations with the United States continue in informal and preparatory channels, Canada has intensified engagement with Europe, Asia, and the Gulf states. These moves are not symbolic. They are designed to reduce exposure to tariffs and to signal that Canada has alternatives. This strategy also reflects a deeper shift in the global economy. Middle powers are no longer content to anchor their economic futures to a single dominant partner. Instead, they are building flexible networks of trade and investment that can absorb shocks and limit vulnerability during trade wars. From Washington's standpoint, this diversification cuts both ways. On one hand, it reduces immediate leverage. On the other, it raises the stakes. If close partners successfully pivot away, the long-term influence of the United States within the global economy could erode. The trade war therefore becomes more than a dispute over tariffs. It becomes a test of leadership, credibility, and strategic foresight. Who adapts faster, who absorbs short-term pain, and who emerges with greater resilience. What makes this moment particularly consequential is that once political lines harden, reversing course becomes far more difficult. Compromises that once seemed pragmatic can suddenly appear politically costly. Trade negotiations slow, uncertainty lingers, and economic damage compounds quietly over time. And this is the critical inflection point, because the next decisions made in Washington and Ottawa will determine whether this trade war stabilizes into managed competition or escalates into something far more disruptive for the global economy. Stay with us, because the next part reveals how these political choices translate into real consequences for workers, consumers, and entire industries on both sides of the border. Trade wars are often discussed in abstract terms, framed around negotiations, leverage, and national strategy. But their real impact is felt far from conference rooms and diplomatic statements. It is felt in workplaces, households, and local communities across North America. As tariffs remain in place, costs rise gradually rather than all at once. Manufacturers facing higher input prices are forced to make difficult choices. Some absorb the costs temporarily, cutting margins and delaying investment. Others pass those costs forward through higher prices or slower wage growth. Over time, these pressures accumulate, especially in sectors tightly integrated across the border. In industries such as steel, automotive, manufacturing, and advanced machinery, workers experience heightened uncertainty. Hiring plans are postponed, overtime hours are reduced, temporary contracts become more common. While mass layoffs may not occur immediately, the erosion of job security becomes a defining feature of the trade war environment. For households, the effects appear quietly. Consumer prices edge upward on goods that rely on cross-border supply chains. Vehicles, appliances, and construction materials become more expensive, even if the increase is spread across months. In a period where inflation sensitivity remains high, these incremental changes matter deeply to middle-income and fixed-income households. In the United States, this creates a contradiction. Tariffs are designed to protect domestic workers, yet many of the cost burdens are borne by American consumers and downstream industries. The trade war thus becomes not only an external conflict, but an internal economic challenge that shapes public perception and political debate. Beyond households, businesses face a more structural dilemma. Trade wars undermine one of the most critical elements of economic growth: predictability. When companies cannot forecast costs, market access, or regulatory conditions, they hesitate to commit capital. In both Canada and the United States, firms report delays in expansion decisions. Cross-border investment slows as executives wait for clarity on tariffs and future trade rules. Smaller and medium-sized enterprises are particularly vulnerable, lacking the financial buffers needed to absorb prolonged uncertainty. This hesitation ripples outward. Fewer investments mean slower productivity growth. Slower growth weakens wage gains, and weaker wage gains reduce consumer spending, reinforcing a cycle of caution throughout the economy. In this way, the trade war exerts a drag that is difficult to capture in headline statistics but deeply felt over time. The global economy amplifies these effects. As trade wars proliferate, multinational firms reassess where they locate production and research. Supply chains that once prioritized efficiency now prioritize resilience. While this can create new opportunities, it also raises costs and fragments markets. For Canada, diversification efforts offer some relief, but they require time. For the United States, the challenge is more complex. As partners adapt and seek alternatives, the long-term influence of American trade policy may weaken, even if short-term leverage appears strong. This is the paradox at the heart of the trade war. Tariffs promise control and protection, yet they often deliver uncertainty and diffuse economic pain. The longer this dynamic persists, the harder it becomes to unwind without consequences. And that brings us to the next critical question. If economic pressure continues to build at this pace, how long can political leaders sustain the strategy before public tolerance begins to erode? Stay with us, because the next part examines the strategic calculations unfolding inside Washington and among its allies, where the real balance of power may already be shifting. From the perspective of the United States, the trade war is often framed as a necessary correction. Tariffs are presented as tools to defend domestic industry, restore bargaining power, and pressure partners into more favorable terms. In the short term, this approach can deliver visible political wins. Certain sectors benefit from reduced foreign competition. Tariffs on imported steel and manufactured goods create temporary breathing room for domestic producers. Politically, this resonates in regions where manufacturing employment carries symbolic and electoral weight. The message is simple and effective. The United States is standing up for itself. However, beneath this narrative lies a more complicated economic reality. Tariffs function as a tax on imports, and those costs do not disappear. They're absorbed by businesses through lower margins, by workers through constrained wage growth, and by consumers through higher prices. Over time, this dampens overall economic efficiency. Within the global economy, the prolonged use of tariffs also raises credibility concerns. Trading partners begin to question whether agreements provide real protection against sudden policy shifts. This uncertainty alters behavior. Companies diversify supply chains. Governments seek alternative markets. And reliance on the United States as an anchor of trade stability weakens. The trade war, therefore, delivers leverage, but at a cost. The longer tariffs remain central to policy, the more they reshape incentives in ways that may reduce the strategic influence of the United States over time. Internationally, the response has been pragmatic rather than confrontational. Countries closely integrated with the United States, including Canada, have avoided direct escalation while quietly adjusting their strategies. The goal is not to sever ties, but to reduce exposure. Middle powers are increasingly coordinating among themselves. Europe, parts of Asia, and resource-rich regions in the Gulf are expanding trade and investment links that bypass traditional dependencies. This reflects a broader shift within the global economy toward diversification and resilience. For Canada, this strategy carries both opportunity and risk. New partnerships open markets and attract capital, but they cannot fully replace the scale and proximity of the United States. The adjustment is gradual and requires sustained political discipline. For Washington, the implications are subtle but significant. As allies become more self-reliant, the effectiveness of tariffs as a pressure tool diminishes. Influence becomes harder to exercise, not because power has vanished, but because alternatives now exist. This is the quiet transformation underway. The trade war is no longer just a bilateral dispute. It is part of a wider reordering of economic relationships, one in which the rules of engagement are less centralized and more fragmented. The critical question is not whether the United States can win individual trade battles. It is whether this approach strengthens or weakens its position within a changing global economy. And this sets the stage for what comes next. Because behind public statements and headline negotiations, there is a longer-term strategy taking shape, one that could redefine how trade wars are fought and resolved in the years ahead. Stay with us, because the final section uncovers the strategic endgame that few policymakers are willing to discuss openly, and the consequences could be far-reaching. At this stage, it becomes clear that this trade war is not being managed as a short-term dispute. It is being treated as a structural reset. Tariffs are no longer temporary bargaining chips. They are instruments meant to reshape behavior, expectations, and long-term alignment within the global economy. From Washington's perspective, the objective extends beyond any single agreement. The United States is signaling that access to its market is conditional, transactional, and subject to political recalibration. This approach forces partners to reassess their economic exposure and security assumptions simultaneously. For Canada, the response has been strategic restraint rather than confrontation. Mark Carney has repeatedly emphasized discipline, patience, and preparation. The underlying logic is straightforward. Rushing into a deal under pressure risks locking in disadvantageous terms that persist long after political cycles shift. Instead, Ottawa is treating the trade war as an adjustment period. Domestic capacity is being strengthened. Defense spending is redirected toward national industry. Trade relationships beyond the United States are being expanded incrementally. None of these moves produce immediate headlines, but together they reduce vulnerability over time. This is why negotiations appear slow and cautious. Delay is not indecision, it is leverage management. Each month that Canada adapts reduces the effectiveness of tariffs as a coercive tool. While the strategy imposes costs on partners, it also carries a rarely discussed risk for the United States itself. When tariffs become a permanent feature of policy, they normalize uncertainty. And uncertainty changes behavior faster than any formal agreement. Firms adjust investment plans, allies hedge their commitments, supply chains fragment. Over time, these adjustments reduce dependence on the United States market, even if demand remains strong. Influence declines not through confrontation, but through quiet substitution. Within the global economy, this dynamic favors flexibility over dominance. Countries that can operate across multiple trade networks gain resilience. Countries that rely primarily on pressure risk isolation, even if unintended. This is the strategic paradox of the trade war. The harder tariffs are used to assert control, the more incentives they create for others to adapt away from that control. What appears as strength in the short term may translate into diminished leverage later. For policymakers in Washington, the challenge is political as much as economic. Reversing course becomes difficult once tariffs are framed as symbols of resolve. Compromise can be portrayed as weakness. Yet maintaining the status quo quietly reshapes the global economy in ways that are difficult to reverse. This is the unresolved tension at the heart of the current strategy. It is not about winning the next negotiation round. It is about determining who sets the rules when trade wars become the norm rather than the exception. And this brings us to the final question. When the dust settles, will this approach leave the United States more secure, or will it discover that the world has already learned how to move on? Stay with us, because the final section delivers the closing assessment that ties together winners, losers, and the lasting consequences of this trade war. What began as a trade dispute has evolved into something far more consequential. This trade war is no longer defined by individual tariffs or sector-specific disagreements. It has become a stress test for political leadership, economic resilience, and strategic foresight within a rapidly changing global economy. For Canada, the challenge has been adaptation under pressure. Faced with an increasingly transactional United States, Ottawa has chosen discipline over haste. The objective has not been to win headlines, but to preserve long-term stability. Diversifying trade relationships, strengthening domestic capacity, and reducing exposure to tariffs are gradual strategies, but they are designed to endure. For the United States, the picture is more complex. Tariffs offer visible leverage and political appeal, particularly in an era of economic anxiety. Yet the costs are diffuse and persistent. Consumers face higher prices, businesses confront uncertainty, and allies quietly adjust their strategies in ways that reduce long-term dependence on American policy decisions. Within the global economy, the implications extend well beyond North America. Trade wars accelerate fragmentation. They encourage parallel supply chains, regional blocs, and alternative partnerships. The rules-based system that once emphasized predictability is giving way to a more fluid, less centralized order. The central question is not whether tariffs can extract concessions in the short term, it is whether repeated reliance on trade pressures strengthens or weakens leadership over time. Influence is not only about market size, it is about trust, consistency, and the willingness of others to align voluntarily. As this trade war continues, the outcomes will shape wages, prices, investment, and security for years to come. The decisions made now will determine whether economic competition stabilizes into managed rivalry or hardens into permanent division. So we leave you with this question. Is this a bold strategy that ultimately strengthens the United States, or a risky mistake that accelerates fragmentation in the global economy?
Subscribe for more fact-based global analysis, where trade wars, tariffs, and economic power are examined beyond the headlines.